Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back. We're doing to the Beelzebub's live stream. Beelzebub's tales to his grandson, reading through the entire book. Welcome to the little reading group, and if you want to help support these live streams and the channel in general, you can become a member or leave a donation via PayPal or Ko-fi. Okay, hello everybody. Let me just turn that down there, and we're back today with chapter 18 once again. If you want to follow along, the exact PDF I'm using is this website, gurdjieff.work. No www. No .coms, it's just gurdjieff.work. Scroll down to the bottom of the main page, library primary texts, you'll find this PDF. So, Chapter 18, The Arch Preposterous. I'm going to be real honest with you guys. This chapter is absolutely bananas. There's a lot of crazy words in it, and it's super long, so I don't even know if I'm going to make it through. Unless I just do like a 2-3 hour freaking live stream just reading this chapter, but let's see how it goes. So, 18. Beelzebub continued as follows. So remember in the last chapter he was talking to Hassien about Jat Klom and all of these principles of the Okidanok, and then he mentions he has a friend on Saturn, who I believe they're going to get into this. So, the cause of my first meeting with the three-centered being who subsequently became my essence friend. And by whom I saw the said experiments with the omnipresent Okidanok was as follows. So the omnipresent Okidanok is this ray of creation. It's described as a ray of creation, but it seems the way Gurdjieff is describing it here is, it seems like it's his version of the universal ether, or a kind of universal ether, or the prime substance, the field that everything arises from. But it and of itself isn't the source. There is a process that the Okidanok itself goes through. Anyway, that you may better represent to yourself of the events of this tale of mine, you must first of all know that at the beginning of my exile to the solar system, let me just move this here, to the solar system, certain corresponding essence friends of mine who had not taken part in those events from which the causes of my exile had issued, performed concerning my personality that sacred process which exists in the universe under the name of the sacred Vishnushlitzval. Sounds Jewish. That is to say, concerning my personality that was implanted in the presences of those three-brained beings by means of another sacred process called... of another sacred process called Askal Nuazar, that which objective science defines by the notion, trust another like yourself. Okay. So what was the bar mitzvah thing here? The Vishnushlitzval. So his friends still trusted him even though he fell. Okay, thanks for the info, Gurdjieff. Well then, just after my arrival in that solar system, our solar system, where we are now, when I began visiting its various planets and first descended upon the surface of the planet Saturn. Yep, Saturn has a surface. It turned out, in connection with the aforesaid, that one of the beings who had undergone the sacred action of Vishnushlitzval regarding my person was what is called there the Harachruchri. That's what that word is. Yep. Of all the three-centered beings arising and existing on that planet. So I think this process of Vishnushlitzval is this, basically, even though he is a vagabond and outcast, you know how like when someone goes to prison and they come out and no one trusts them? This sacred action or principle is there, so even if someone makes a mistake, there are still people around who will trust them. And this word here is the title of someone on the planet Saturn. On that planet Saturn, a being is called the Harahururi, who is the sole chief over all the other beings on that planet. So like the king. Oh, he says it down here. Similar being chiefs exist also on all other planets upon which three-brained beings breed. Try saying that 3 times fast. They are differently named on different planets, and on your planet, Earth, such a chief is called a king. The only difference is that while everyone else, even on all the other planets of the same system, there is one such king for the whole of the given planet, on your peculiar planet Earth, there is a separate king for each accidentally segregated group of these favorites of yours, and sometimes even several. Well then, when I first descended on the surface of the planet Saturn and mingled with the 3-scented beings there, it chanced that I had occasion the next day to meet the king, the Harahururi himself of the planet Saturn. And during what is called our exchange of subjective opinions, he invited me to make his own Harhuri, that is his own palace. He invited me to make his own, I guess to go back to his own palace? The chief place of my existence during the whole sojourn on their planet. Okay. And this I did. So they're either going back to a palace or he's helping him make a palace. So my boy, when we were once talking simply according to the flow of what is called being associative mentation, so they're just riffing. He was just riffing with the king of Saturn, and happened to touch on the question, among other things, of the strange results actualized in the manifestations or the particularities of the omnipresent Okidanok. The venerable Harahururi of the planet Saturn first mentioned that one of his learned being's subjects by the name of Harhark, they all look like crows or ravens, so that's funny, had recently devised for the elucidation of many of the previously unexplained properties of that cosmic substance an exceedingly interesting appliance which he called a Raharar. Yep. The chief demonstrating part of which he called a Gurdjieff, a Jesus Christ, arch preposterous indeed. And further, he offered to make, if I wished, the necessary arrangements for showing me all these new invitations, and for giving me every possible explanation of them. Okay, so they're talking about a scientist, and the scientist is doing an experiment on the Okidanok. So the results of it all was that the following day, escorted by one of the venerable Harahururi's court, I went to the place of existence of that Gornahur Harhak, where I first saw those novel elucidatory experiments with the omnipresent Okidanok. Okay. We still got the thread of what's actually happening. Gornahur Harhak, who afterwards, as I have already told you, became my essence friend, was then considered one of the foremost scientists among the ordinary 3-brained beings of the whole universe, and all his constatations, as well as the elucidatory apparatuses he had invented, were everywhere widespread, and other learned beings on the various planets were using them more and more. Here it will do no harm to remark that I also, thanks only to his learning, had later in my observatory on the planet Mars that Tescuano, which, when it was finally established, enabled my sight to perceive, or as is said, approach the visibility of remote cosmic concentrations. Okay, so this guy, Harhak, is the one who made the telescope that Beelzebub uses to spy on people, to investigate things over the galaxy. Okay, that's interesting. Strictly speaking, it was owing to just this tescuano, the telescope, basically. Although they never explain exactly what it looks like, so it's just some device that acts like a telescope, that extends Beelzebub's vision so he can investigate things. That my observatory was afterwards considered one of the best constructions of its kind in the whole universe. And most important of all, it was by means of this tescuano that I myself thereafter could, even while staying at home on the planet Mars, relatively easily see and observe the processes of the existence occurring on the surfaces of those parts of the other planets of that solar system, which, in accordance with what is called the common cosmic harmonious movement, could perceive by being sight at the given moment. So he could see things. When Gornahor Harhak was informed who we were and why we had come, he approached us and forthwith very amiably take a shot every time my dyslexia kicks in, began his explanations. Before beginning his explanations, I think it not inadvisable to warn you once and for all that all my conversations with the various three-centered beings existing on various planets of that system where I was obliged to exist for the sins of my youth, as for instance, in the present case, the conversations with this Gorno Harhak, which I am now about to relate to you while we travel on the spaceship Karnak, all proceeded in dialects still quite unknown to you. Sometimes, by the way, in such dialects the consonances of which were quite indigestible for perception by normal being functions assigned for this purpose. And so, my boy, in view of all this, I shall not repeat these conversations word for word, but shall give you only their sense in our speech. Somehow I don't think this is going to be just the gist. I think it's going to be long paragraphs of dialogue. That's just a hunch. Continuing, of course, to employ those terms and specific names, yeah, thanks, or rather those consonances produced by what are called being vocal cords, which you're straining my being vocal cords, are used by your favorites on the planet Earth, and which have now become for you, owing to continued repetition during my tales about them, habitually and easily perceived. Yes, it must be noticed that the word Gornor is used by three-brained beings on the planet Saturn in courtesy. They utter it before the name of one whom they are addressing. It is the same with your favorites on the planet Earth. They also have added to the name of every person the word Mr. Okay, so Gornor just means Mr., it's a title. Or sometimes a whole meaningless phrase expressing the notion, for which our Honourable Mullah Nasser Eddin has the following sentence. I should go back and read some Mullah Nasser Eddin stories. They're great stories if anyone's a fan of Idris Shah. Anyway, namely, he says, nevertheless, there's more reality in it than in the wiseacrings of an expert in monkey business. So, people who have a bunch of titles in front of their name, Doctor, PhD, this and that, he's basically just saying it's meaningless. Basically, just a single honorific like Mr. is enough to be amiable. When this subsequent essence friend of mine, Gurnor Harhak, Mr. Harhak, welcome, was informed of what was required of him, he invited us by a sign to approach one of the special appliances which he had made, and which, as it later turned out, was named by him Saha. Yep, that's what that word is. That's how you say it. When we were nearer the said special and very strange construction, he pointed to it with a particular feather of his right wing and said, "This special appliance is the principal part of the whole of my new invention. And it is just in this that the results are revealed and shown of almost all the peculiarities of the omnipresent world substance Okidanok." Okay. Almost all. So he basically has unlocked the mysteries of the Okidanok with this device. and pointing to all the other special appliances also present in the There's no vowel. There's no vowel. How am I supposed to say this word? He added, I succeeded in obtaining extremely important elucidations concerning the omnipresent and everywhere penetrating Okidanok. Pretty sure Krier is his laboratory. Because thanks to all these separate special appliances of my invention, it became possible first to obtain all three fundamental parts of the omnipresent Okidanok. So, the law of three, the three forces of the Trimanisty Kazna, he was able to capture separately and analyze separately. And that rendered on information of the whole substance of the Okidanok. From every kind of and intraplanetary process, and then artificially to blend them into a whole. And secondly, also artificially to disassociate them and elucidate the specific properties of each part separately in its manifestations. Having said this, he again pointed to the Kriharhartsaha, yeah, that's right, and added that by means of the elucidating apparatus, not only can any ordinary being clearly understand the details of the properties of the three absolutely independent parts, which in their manifestations have nothing in common, of the whole unique active element. The particularities of which are the chief cause of everything existing in the universe. Interesting. But also, any ordinary being can become categorically convinced that no results of any kind normally obtained from the processes occurring through this omnipresent world substance can ever be perceived by beings or sensed by them. Certain being functions, however, can perceive only those results of the said processes which proceed for some reason or other abnormally. So we only know when things are going wrong. Or really what he's talking about the octave present Okidanok. He's talking about the Okidanok. And he's talking about how to study it. And normally your vision or your being senses, whatever you have, can only see effects, not causes. So, or if something's wrong, an abnormality, you notice it. Whereas his machine is able to see everything else. On account of causes coming from without and issuing either from conscious sources or from accidental mechanical results. That's the end of that sentence. The part of Mr. Harhack's new invention, which he himself called the and regarded as the most important, was in appearance very much like the Terzikiano, or as your favorites would say, a huge electric lamp. Okay, so Terzikiano is a lamp. The interior of this special structure was rather like a smallish room with a door that could be hermetically closed. Okay. So there's a giant structure that looks like a giant lamp, but you can go inside it. The walls of this original construction were made of a certain transparent material, so plastic or glass. Oh yeah, here we go, glass. The appearance of which reminded me of that which on your planet is called glass. Got 'em. As I learned later, the chief particularity of this said transparent material was that although by means of the organ of sight beings could perceive through it the visibility of every kind of cosmic concentration, yet no rays of any kind, whatever the causes they may have arisen from, could pass through it, either from within out or from without in. Okay, so basically it's a sealed chamber where radiation can't get in. So you can see being concentrations, in other words, objects or people inside the structure, and they can see out, but the rays that you emit, the energy you emit, doesn't pass through the wall, and energy from the outside doesn't come in. So it's a sealed chamber where they can do scientific experiments. Thank you for the explanation, Gurdjieff. As I looked at this part of this said astonishing being invention, I could, through its transparent walls, clearly distinguish inside, in the center, what seemed to be a table with 2 chairs. Interrogation chamber, indeed. Hanging above the table, what is called an electric lamp. So, and there he says electric lamp. He doesn't say Terzikiano. Where's your Terzikiano, huh? Anyway, and underneath it, 3 things exactly alike, each resembling the Momo Ono Duar, Yoko Ono. On the table and by the side of it stood or lay several different apparatuses and instruments unknown to me. Sometimes he'll just say a word and he won't describe it, so I'm just going to keep reading and he'll explain it later. On the yeah, okay. Instruments unknown to me. So there's a table. The table had a bunch of apparatuses on it. In my mind, I'm just like imagining, like, you know, like one of those set-up radio stations. Like, yeah, they. Anyway, later it became clear that the said objects contained in this chamber, this device, the Hrahar, as well as everything we had later to put on, were made of special materials invented by this Gornohor Harhak. And as regards these materials also, I shall explain a little more in detail at the proper time in the course of my further explanations concerning Mr. Harhak. Meanwhile, bear in mind that in the enormous kir, or workshop, there we go, laboratory workshop of Gornor Harhak, there were, besides the already mentioned, oh god, Hrahar Hartsahar, several other large... I nailed that just then, by the way. I nailed that. That deserves recognition. Several other large independent appliances, and among them 2 quite special, what are called life chakans, which Gornor himself called Jesus Christ. Kirhihirihi. That's as good as it gets. It is interesting to note that your favorites also have something like this life chakan or kirhihiri, and they name such an apparatus a dynamo. Okay, so it's like a generator. There was also other independent large appliances, which, as it afterwards appeared, was a solu norahuna of special construction, or as your favorites would say, a pump of complex construction for exhausting atmosphere to the point of absolute vacuum. I don't think we ever say that sentence, Jiv, but okay. Okay, so what do we got here? Okay, so there's a dynamo, so there's an electrical generator, and then there's a pump that turns the chamber into a vacuum. It's okay, Heidi. I'm not sure if you can hear my dog whimpering. Anyway, while I was looking over all this with surprise, Gornor Harhak himself approached the said pump of special construction with his left wing, moved one of its parts, owing to which a certain mechanism began to work in the pump. He then approached us again, and pointing with the same special feather of his right wing to the largest life chakan, or, oh my god, okay, let's give it a go. Hirhi, or dynamo, further continued his explanations. He said, by means of this special appliance, there are first sucked in, separately from the atmosphere or from any intra or surplanetary formation, all the 3 independent parts of the omnipresent active element Okidanok present in it, and only afterwards, when in a certain way these separate independent parts are artificially reblended in the dynamo, or Krihihirhi, into a single whole. Okay. So this is interesting. So the Okidanok gets broken into pieces and then are reblended in the dynamo, in the electrical dynamo, into a single whole. Does the Okidanok, now in its usual state, flow, and is it concentrated there in that container, saying which he again, with the same special feather, pointed to something very much like what is called a generator. What's the difference between a generator and a dynamo? Both are the same thing. Versus generator? Hold up. Dynamos and generators convert mechanical rotation to electrical power. Dynamo, a device that makes a direct current electric power or power using electromagnetism. It is also known as a generator. So they're the same thing? What the hell? However, the term generator normally refers to an alternator, which creates alternating current power. Okay, okay. So a dynamo... So dynamos are only DC. Something electromagnetism, and generators alternate current. Okay. And so he's got both? Anyway, okay. Let's go. Let's keep going. Let's leave ourselves in a kind of an ambient ununderstanding. And then from there, he said, it's something to do with electricity. And then from there, he said, Okidanok flows here into another or dynamo, where it undergoes the process of Jartklom. So that's the breaking apart process. And each of its separate parts is concentrated there in those other containers. Okay. So it seems he's getting he's doing some kind of scientific, or he's doing some kind of experiment with electricity, which is ether, Okidanok, and he's breaking it apart into its constituent parts via cosmic processes like Jartklom and containing them. And this time he pointed to what resembled accumulators, and only then do I take from the secondary containers, by means of various artificial appliances, each active part of Okidanok separately for my own elucidatory experiments. I shall first demonstrate to you, he continued, one of the results which occur when, for some reason or other, one of the active parts of the omnipresent Okidanok is absent during the process of their striving to reblend into a whole. And they re-come together. It's very interesting. So he does these experiments where there's three parts, but one of the parts is missing. And so the two parts will strive to reblend, and he basically just sees what's going to happen when there's two parts smashing together. At the present moment, this special construction contains a space which is indeed an absolute vacuum, obtained, it must be said, only owing firstly to the special construction of the suction pump, and to the materials of special quality of which the instruments are made, which alone make experiments possible in an absolute vacuum, and secondly, to the properties and the strength of the material of which the walls of this part of my new invention are made. Having said this, he pulled another lever and again continued. Owing to the pulling of this lever, that process has begun in this vacuum whereby in the separate parts of the omnipresent Okidanok there proceeds what is called the striving to reblend into a whole. But since intentionally, by an able reason in the present case, myself, the participation of the third part of the Okidanok existing under the name of Parijrar Chatnatius is artificially excluded from the said process. Then this process proceeds there just now between only two of its parts, namely between those two independent parts which science names anodnaceous and cathodnaceous. Bruh. And in consequence, instead of the obligatory law-conformable results of the said process, that non-law-conformable result is now actualized, which exists under the denomination of the result of the process of the reciprocal destruction of two opposing forces. Or, as ordinary beings express it, the cause of artificial light. How does light produce in a light bulb? Isn't just electrical current going through magnesium? Two forces come together and try to destroy each other, and that creates light. Is that what he's saying? The striving to reblend into a whole of two active parts of the omnipresent Okidanok, it makes me wonder, where did Gurdjieff get this from? Clearly he's got some knowledge of electricity, which, this is back in the day. So he's really trying to like add science kind of into sciencey talk into this kind of doctrine. It all has to do with electromagnetism and electricity and ether and light. There's something here. It makes me wonder as well, because he was in Russia for a time. And you know, people kind of dunk on Soviet science and all that, but there was that kind of movement. You know, science in the West became materialistic, or it has arbitrary materialistic limitations to it. Whereas in Russia, there was this movement called cosmicism, or something like that. And it's very strange, like kind of almost mystical. I'm not sure. I don't think Gurdjieff was exposed to that though. But there's really weird stuff in Russia. God, where did he get? So there's something important here. There's something important. Remember, last chapter there was something, he was started to talk about crystallizations in the Okidanok. And it's important because we ourselves want to do a crystallization ourselves. We want to crystallize within ourselves an astral body. So he's leaving stuff here. There's something in all of these chapters on Okidanok and ether. What is ether? Energy, life force, electricity, magnetism. There's some relationship here that he's pointing towards. It may be between the lines, not exactly something that he says, but even an absence is a presence. What is he saying? What is he not saying? Let's keep looking. There's something mysterious here, which is proceeding at the present moment there in this vacuum, has a force as calculated by objective science of 3,040,000, what are called volts. Okay. And this force is indicated by the needle of that special appliance there, pointing to a something very much like the apparatus existing also on your planet, and called their voltmeter, he said. One of the advantages of this new invention of mine for the demonstration of the given phenomena is that in spite of the unusual power of the processes of the force of striving now proceeding there, the what are called Salnichizinuarnian momentum vibrations, which most beings consider to be also to be raised. Just say raised, bruh. And which ought to be obtained and to issue from this process. Do not issue out of the place of their arising, that is, out of this construction in which the particularities of the omnipresent Okidanok are being elucidated. Makes me wonder, is he like talking about 0-point energy? He's working with ether and... There's something weird about these descriptions. And in order that the beings who are outside of this part of my invention may nevertheless also have the possibility of elucidating the force of the given process, I intentionally made the composition of the material of the wall in one place such that it has the property of permitting the passage through it of the said Salnichizinuarnian momentum vibrations or rays. Okay, so part of the wall actually does let rays out. Having said this, he approached nearer to the Tzachar and pressed a certain button. The result was that the whole of the enormous kir, or workshop, was suddenly so strongly lit up that our organs of sight temporarily ceased to function. And only after a considerable time had passed could we with great difficulty raise our eyelids and look around. Jeez, going a bit Oppenheimer there. When we had recovered, and Gur Nahor Harhak had pulled still another lever, which resulted in the whole surrounding space being restored to its former usual appearance, he first, with his customary angel voice, oh, he had an angelic voice, again drew our attention to the voltmeter, the needle of which constantly indicated the same figure, and then continued. You see that, although the process of the clash of two opposite component parts of the omnipresent Okidanok, of the same power of force of striving, still continues, and that the part of the surface of this construction which has the property of admitting the passage of the said rays is still open, yet in spite of all of this, there is no longer the phenomenon which ordinary beings define by the phrase, the causes of artificial light. Okay, so that artificial light that happened that blinded them all is no longer going on, but the same powers are still ongoing, the force drivings. And this phenomenon is no longer there only because of my last pulling of a certain lever. I introduced into the process of the clash of two component parts of Okidanok a current of third independent component of Okidanok. Okay, so he split the Okidanok into three pieces, into three separate containers, and then when he pulled a lever, two of the containers, these parts of the Okidanok, two of the three forces, collided together and created all of that light, that artificial light that they saw. When he pulled another lever, it let the third one in, which mixed in and blended perfectly, and so the light stopped issuing, which began to blend proportionally with its other two parts, owing to which the result derived from this kind of blending of the three component parts of the omnipresent Okidanok, unlike the process of the non-law conformable blending of its two parts, cannot be perceived by beings with any of their being functions. Okay. What did he say that? So three component parts. So there's still something being emitted, but we can't see it with our being functions? Whatever. After all these explanations of his, Gur Nahor Harhak then proposed that I should venture to enter with him, that demonstrating part itself of his new invention, in order that I might become there within an eyewitness of many particular manifestations of the omnipresent and everything penetrating active element. Of course, without thinking long about it, I immediately decided and gave him my consent. Science needs consent. And I immediately decided, chiefly, because I expected to obtain in my being unchangeable and imperishable objective essence satisfaction, when this future essence friend of mine had my consent, he at once gave the necessary orders to one of his assistants. It appeared that for the actualization of what he proposed, various preparations had first to be made. First of all, his assistants put on Gorenor, Mr. Harhak, and myself some special heavy suits, resembling those which your favorites call diving suits. So I assume that's like the old style diving suit with the big kind of head, but with many small heads of what are called bolts projecting. And when these extremely peculiar suits had been put on us, his assistants screwed up the heads of these bolts in a certain order, On the inner side of these diving suits, at the ends of the bolts, there were, it appeared, special plates which pressed against parts of our planetary body in a certain way. It later also became quite clear to me that this was necessary in order that there might not occur to our planetary bodies what is called taran uranura, or as it might otherwise be said, in order that our planetary bodies should not fall to pieces, as usually occurs to sur and interplanetary formations of every kind when they happen to come into an entirely atmosphereless space. So they're space suits, basically. This is really interesting. Before the space race, he was already talking about spacesuits, basically. In addition to these special suits, they placed on our heads a something resembling what is called a diver's helmet, but with a very complicated, what are called connectors projecting from them. One of these connectors, which was called the how do you even say this? There you go. That's how you pronounce that word. Meaning sustainer of the pulsation. Yeah, I'm struggling to sustain my pulsation reading this sometimes, Gurdjieff. You don't want it to be easy. Was something long, like a rubber tube, I bet it was. One end of it, by means of complicated appliances on the helmet itself, was hermetically attached to the corresponding place of the helmet for the breathing organs, while the other end, after we had already entered the strange Hrahartsacha, was screwed to an apparatus there, which was connected in its turn with the space, the presence of which corresponded to the second being food, which is air. Second being food is air. Okay, so they're getting air. Between Gurnor Harhak and myself, there was also a special connector through which we could easily communicate with each other while we were inside the Hrahartsacha, from which the atmosphere was pumped out to make a vacuum. Alright. One end of this connector also, by means of appliances that were on the helmets, was fitted in a certain way to what are called my organs of hearing and speech. So now they got walkie-talkies, and the other end was fitted to the same organs of Gurnor Harhak. Thus, by means of this connector between my subsequent essence friend and myself, there was set up, as again your favourites would say, a peculiar telephone. Without this appliance, we could not have communicated with each other in any way, chiefly because Gurnor Harhak was at that time still a being with a presence perfected only up to the state called the sacred Inkorzarno. Okay, wait a second. Without that appliance, we would not be able to communicate, because he had only perfected himself up to a state of sacred Inkorzarno. So different beings reach different states of perfection. There's a hierarchy, and different people in these different beings in these different states have different qualities or faculties. So the implication here is if Harhak was of a higher being perfection, he may have been able to communicate without a physical device. Very interesting. And a being with such a presence not only cannot manifest himself in an absolutely empty space, meaning that perhaps there are beings that can, but he cannot even exist in it, even though the products of all the three being foods be artificially introduced into him in such a space. But the most curious, and as it is said, the most cunningly ingenious of all the connectors there for various purposes on those strange diving suits and helmets was the connector created by the great scientist Gurnor Harhak to enable the organ of sight of ordinary beings to perceive the visibility of all kinds of surrounding objects in an absolutely empty space. One end of this astonishing connector was fitted in a certain way, also by means of appliances on the helmets, to our temples, which the other end was joined to what is called the amscumutator, which in its turn was joined in a certain way by means of what are called wires to all the objects within the Hrachar, as well as to those outside, namely to those objects whose visibility was needed during experiments. So they have their life signals connected to their temples or whatever. It is very interesting to notice here that to each end of the appliance, a creation almost incredible for ordinary three-centered being reason, two independent connectors, also of wire, were led, and through them what are called special magnetic currents flowed from outside. As it was afterwards explained to me in detail, these connectors and the said special magnetic currents had, it seems, been created by that truly great scientist Gurnahur in order that the presences of learned three-centered beings, even those not perfected to the sacred Inkozarno, might, owing to one property of the magnetic current, be reflected for their own essences, and that owing to another property of this current, the presence of the mentioned objects might also be reflected, so that thereby the perception of the reality of the said objects might be actualized by their imperfect organs of being sight, in a vacuum containing none of these factors, or those results of various cosmic concentrations. I guess because the idea is in a vacuum, there's nothing, so there's no light, so you wouldn't be able to see anything, is what he's going off. But he's saying, even though they're in a vacuum, in these suits, they have some kind of a device that allows them to perceive even though they're in a vacuum. I don't know what the theories and science was on vacuums back in the day when Gurdjieff was writing this, but I think he's just covering his bases in case someone more scientifically minded is reading this and being like, that's not how it works. Actually. So anyway, I think that's what he's doing. Which have received such vibrations, from the actualization of which alone the functions of any being organ whatsoever is possible. Having fitted upon us the said very heavy appliances for enabling beings to exist in a sphere not corresponding for them, the assistance of this then still great all-universal scientist Gurnahur Harhak, with the help again of special appliances, carried us into the Hrachartsachar itself, and having screwed up all the free ends of the connectors projecting from us to the corresponding apparatuses in the Hrachartsachar itself, I'm gonna get through this, went out and hermetically closed behind them the only way by which it was still possible, if at all, to have any communication with what is called the everything representing one world. What? When we were alone in the Hrachartsachar itself, Gurnahur Harhak, after turning one of what are called switches there, said, "The work of the pump has already begun, and soon it will have pumped out all the results here without exception of those cosmic processes, whatever they may be, the totality of the results of which is the basis and significance, as well as the process itself, of the maintenance of the existence of everything existing in the whole of this everything representing one world." And he added in a half-sarcastic tone, "Soon we shall be absolutely isolated from everything existing and functioning in the whole of the universe, but on the other hand, owing firstly to my new invention, and secondly to the knowledge we have already attained for ourselves, we have not only now the possibility of returning to the said world to become again a particle of all that exists, but also we shall soon be worthy to become non-participating eyewitnesses of certain of these world laws, which for ordinary uninitiated three-centered beings are what they called great inscrutable mysteries of nature." So he's unlocking the mysteries of nature, but which in reality are only natural and very simple results, automatically flowing one from the other. Okay. While he was speaking, one could feel that this pump, another also very important part of the whole of his new invention, was perfectly actualizing the work assigned to it by this being with reason. To enable you to represent yourself and understand better the perfection of this part, also of the whole of this new invention of Gornochorharhak, I must not fail to tell you also about the following. Although I personally, as a three-brained being, also had occasion many times before, owing to certain particular reasons, to be in atmosphereless spaces and had to exist, sometimes for a long time, by means of the sacred Cream Bulazumara alone, and although from frequent repetition a habit had been acquired in my presence of moving from one sphere to another gradually and almost without feeling any inconvenience from the change in the presence of the second being food occurring within the change of the presences of cosmic substances undergoing transformation, and which are always around both large and small cosmic concentrations, and also although the causes themselves of my arising and the subsequent processes of my being existence were arranged in an entirely special way, in consequence of which the various being functions contained within my common presence had perforce gradually become also special, yet nevertheless, in spite of it all, the pumping out of the atmosphere by the said pump then proceeded with such force that such sensations were impressed on the separate parts of the whole of my presence that even today I can clearly experience the process of the flow of my state at the time and relate it to you almost in detail. So I think Beelzebub is of a higher being state than this other, than Harhak. So he can actually move from one state to another or even exist in a vacuum by himself, but it's like being in the pumping mechanism was still discomfortable for him, or still like whoa, an experience. This extremely strange state began in me shortly after. Gornochorharhak had spoken in a half-sarcastic tone about our imminent situation. In all my three being centers, namely in the three centers localized in the presence of every three-centered being, and which exist under the names of thinking, feeling, and moving centers, there began to be perceived separately and independently in each of them, in a very strange and unusual way, very definite impressions that were taking place in the separate parts of my whole planetary body, an independent process of the sacred, Raskurano, and that the cosmic crystallizations which composed the presences of these parts were flowing in vain. At first, something's going wrong inside of him? His cosmic crystallizations are flowing in vain. At first, what is called my initiative of constantation proceeded... What is constantation? What the hell does constantation mean? That's a word I haven't seen in a while. Remember, my education was free. Constantation, a French word? What's the meaning of constantation? Process of verification. Okay. First, what is called my initiative of constantation, or he's verifying with his being essence, I don't know, with his being reason, proceeded in the usual way, that is, according to what is called the center of gravity of associative experiencing. That's interesting. Associative experiencing, because usually we experience things with like a sense. We see something, but we also smell it and hear it, and we can feel it, but we don't notice that all at once. We usually rely on one sense. Maybe if we're not looking at something and we hear a person, we only perceive them without our hearing, and then as soon as we look at them, the hearing goes away and we just look at them. And maybe if they start talking, we as you talk to someone, you're listening to them, but you both kind of look away and talk. But there's this thing where if you allow all of your senses to blend together as you experience something, it produces an interesting synesthesia. Which is not a synesthesia as in like the medical condition synesthesia, but a willed for technique synesthesia, which can kind of reveal certain things about an object or a person that you're working with. But he's saying there's a center of gravity of associative experiencing. Which would be the consciousness itself, maybe? That's behind all of the functioning parts that can gain and mix and synthesize all the experiences into some kind of Gnostic cognition. Anyway, but later, when this initiative of constantation of everything proceeding in me gradually and almost imperceptibly became the function of my essence alone, the latter not only became the unique all-embracing initiator of the constating of everything proceeding in me, but also everything without exception of that which newly proceeded began to be perceived by and fixed in this essence of mine. So this is interesting because I think he's brought all this sciencey talk, and they're in a vacuum chamber and things like that. But this is what meditation is you're closing yourself off to the world. You're being in a void. And what happens when you're in a void? Well, if your senses are closed to the world, all of a sudden your internal world lights up, and his being processes inside of him is like basically just shooting off on all cylinders. And if something that's not a part of that system interacts with it, it impresses on his essence. And although he doesn't perceive it with his sight or hearing or sound, he somatically feels it. And that may represent in his consciousness some way, some form of being data. And this is how, via meditation, we receive visions, or maybe voices, or maybe just direct intuitions of knowledge. It's like those visions, you may experience a vision of a being in a meditation, but it's not the vision itself. It's something he has impressed on you, some form of knowledge, and that is represented by a vision or a voice, just purely within you. There's something in it that's very interesting. Okay. Now, from the moment that my essence began to perceive impressions directly, and to constate independently that from what was preceding, there was being entirely destroyed, as it were, in my common presence. Firstly, the parts of my planetary body, and then, little by little, also the localizations of the second and third being centers. At the same time, a constantation was definitely made. What the? Constantation? Verification. Sorry, a verification was made. Sorry, let me just read that again. Planetary body, and then little by little, also the localizations of the second and third being centers. At the same time, a constantation was definitely made that the functioning of these latter senses passed gradually to my thinking center and became proper to it. Okay, hold on a second. So his sense of his body then disappeared, and then the localization of the second and third being center, so the feeling and moving center, at the same time basically passed to his thinking center and became proper to it. So it's almost like all of those, his centers were combined into one center, the thinking center, with the increasing intensity of its functioning. So because there's no other center functioning, his thinking center just went crazy, which is what happens when you close your eyes and meditate. All of a sudden your thoughts just start churning. Of its functioning became the unique, powerful perceiver of everything actualized outside of itself, and the autonomous initiator of the constating of everything proceeding in the whole of my presence, as well as outside of it. While this strange, and to my reason then, still incomprehensible being experiencing was proceeding in me, Goran Nahor Harhak himself was occupied in pulling some levers and switches, which there were very many at the edges of the table where we were placed. Okay. An incident which happened to Gornahor Harhak himself changed all this being experiencing of mine, and in my common presence the usual inner being experiencing was resumed. The following is what happened. Gornahor Harhak, with all those unusual heavy appliances which had been put on him as well, suddenly found himself at a certain height above the chair and began to flounder, as our dear Mullah Nasser ad-Din says, like a puppy who has fallen into a deep pond. So gravity failed and he just started floating and was like, oh! As it afterwards proved, my friend Gornahor Harhak had made a mistake while pulling the mentioned levers and switches, and had made certain parts of his planetary body more tense than was necessary. In consequence, his presence together with everything on him had received a shock, and also the momentum given by the shock, and owing to the tempo proceeding in his presence from taking in the second being food and to the absence of any resistance in that absolutely empty space, he began to drift, or as I have already said, to flounder like a puppy who has fallen into a deep pond. Lol. Having said this with a smile, Beelzebub became silent. A little later, he made a very strange gesture with his left hand, and with an intonation not proper to his own voice, he continued. While I am gradually recalling and telling you about all this concerning the events of a period of my existence now long since past, the wish arises in me to make a sincere confession to you. Just to you, one of my direct heirs, who must inevitably represent the sum of all my deeds during the periods of the process of my past being existence, and namely, I wish sincerely to confess to you that when my essence, with the participation of the parts of my presence subject to it alone, had independently decided to take a personal part in those scientific elucidatory experiments with the demonstrating part of the new invention of Gornahor Harhak, and I had entered into this demonstrating part without the least compulsion from outside, yet in spite of it all my essence allowed to creep into my being and to be developed side by side with the said strange experiencings, a criminally egoistic anxiety for the safety of my personal existence. However, my boy, in order that you may not at this moment be too distressed, it is not superfluous to add that this happened to me then for the first and also the last time during all the periods of my being existence. So is he saying he's about to, like, in this story he panicked when he saw Gornahor floating or something? Or he's gonna lead to this. But perhaps he's either gonna say, he's either preempting, telling Hassian that he himself also started panicking, or he just, I'm guessing he's going to say something like, oh, he burst out laughing that Gornahor was just flopping around. But perhaps it would be better for the present not to touch on questions that concern exclusively only our family. Let us return to the tale I have begun about the omnipresent Okidanok and my essence friend Gornahor Harhak, who was, by the way, at one time considered everywhere among ordinary three-brained beings as a great scientist, and is now, though he still continues to exist, not only considered not great, but thanks to his own result, that is to say, to his own son, is what our dear Mullah Nasser ad-Din would call a has-been. Oof! Or, as he sometimes says in such cases, he is already sitting in an old American galosh. An old American galosh. That's so that's going to be a reference. I don't know. Ask your grandparents what a galosh is. Actually, let's just. These are like old sayings from 1940s or something. What does galosh mean? Galosh? Galoshes. Just rubber boots. He's sitting in rubber boots. Old American rubber boot. Older. So is like cowboy boots old American? American galosh. What is this American cowboy boots? Is that what he's saying? Yeah, but like what does that phrase mean? He's sitting in his old boots. He's a has-been. He used to be a great scientist, but now he's a has-been. What is this story? Why is he saying this? Anyway, well then, while floundering, Gornahur Harhak with great difficulty, and only by means of a special and very complicated maneuver, which he made, finally managed to get his planetary body, burdened with the various unusually heavy appliances, down into the chair again. And this time he fixed it all with the aid of special screws, which were on the chair for that purpose. And when we were both more or less arranged and communication was possible between us, by means of the said artificial connectors, he first drew my attention to those apparatuses hanging over the table, which I told you were very much like monoduars. Okay. Also, you notice Beelzebub never said what his reaction was to Harhak floating around. He just had that preamble and then just moved on. Maybe that's supposed to be like a Rorschach test. Like what do you think Beelzebub himself, how do you think he reacted? And why did he change his intonation of voice? This is so strange. Like this is such a strange writing style. On close inspection, all these were alike in appearance and served as 3 identical sockets. So these are the momonodors, from the ends of which carbon candles projected, which as are usually to be found in the apparatuses which your favorites call electric arc lamps. Having drawn my attention to these socket-like monoduars, he said, each of these externally similar apparatuses has a direct connection with those secondary containers which I pointed out to you while we were still outside, and in which, after the artificial Jartklom, each of the active parts of Akidonok collects into a general mass. I have adapted these 3 independent apparatuses in such a way. So this is Harhak talking, I think. There in this absolutely empty space we can obtain from those secondary containers for the required experiment as much as we wish of every part of Okidanok in a pure state, and also we can at will exchange the force of the striving to reblend into a whole, which is acquired in them and which is proper to them according to the degree of density of the concentration of the mass. So I'm not sure if he's thinking each one has an electrical charge, 1 negative, 1 positive, and 1 neutral, maybe? That's what he's going for? And here within this absolutely empty space, I shall first of all show you that that same non-law conformable phenomenon which we recently observed while we were outside the place where it proceeded. And namely, I shall again demonstrate to you this world phenomenon which occurs when, after a law conformable Jartklom, the separate parts of the whole Akidonok meet in a space outside of a law conformable arising, without the participation of one part, strive to reblend in a whole. Okay, so he's just talking through the process again of the Akidonok breaking apart, and when you combine, when you just have 2 and not 3, they still strive to combine, but it doesn't work properly, and you get an effect out of that. Having said this, he first closed that part of the surface of the Krachahar Tsahar, the composition of which the property of allowing rays to pass through it. Then he pulled 2 switches and pressed a certain button, as a result of which the small plate lying on that table, composed of a certain special mastic, automatically moved toward the mentioned carbon candles. And then, having again drawn my attention to the ammeter and the voltmeter, he added, I have again admitted the influx of parts of the Okidanok, namely the anodnaceous and the cathodnaceous, of equal force to striving to reblend. When I looked at the ammeter and the voltmeter, indeed saw that their needles moved and stopped on the same figures I had noticed the first time we were still outside. the Hrachar-Hartzahar, I was greatly surprised, because in spite of the indications of the needles and the intimation of Gornohor-Harhak himself, I had neither noticed nor sensed any change in the degree of my perception of the visibility of the surrounding objects. So, without waiting for his further explanations, I asked him, "But why then is there no result from the non-law conformable striving to blend into a whole of the parts of the Okidanok?" So the first time they did this, that huge light erupted, which blinded them for a moment. So he's asking why that's not happening this time. Before replying to this question, he turned off the only lamp, which worked from a special magnetic current. My astonishment increased still more, because in spite of the darkness which instantly ensued, it could clearly be seen through the walls of the Hrachar-Hartzahar that the needles of the ammeter and voltmeter still stood in their former places. Only after I had somehow got accustomed to such a surprising constatation, Gornohor-Harhak said, "I have already told you that the composition of the material of which the walls of this construction in which we are at this moment are made possesses the property of not allowing any vibrations arising from any source whatsoever to pass through it, with the exception of certain vibrations arising from nearby concentrations. And these later vibrations can be perceived by the organs of sight of three-brained beings, and even then, of course, only of normal beings." Okay. Furthermore, according to the law of heteratiogeter, the rays, or Salnichizinurarnian momentum vibrations, or rays, require the property of acting on the organs of perception of being only after they have passed a limit defined by science in the following formula. The result of the manifestation is proportionate to the force of striving received from the shock. The result of manifestation proportionate to the force of striving. So if the force of striving isn't up to or matching a certain level of manifestation, it's not going to, the ray isn't going to shock you in the same way or create light in the same way. I think that's what he's saying. Tell me what you think in the comments down below. Jesus Christ. And so, as the given process of the clash of the two parts of the Okidanok has the strength of great power, the result of the clash is manifested much further than the place of its arising. Now look, he says with an exclamation mark. Having said this, he pressed some other button. Suddenly, the whole interior of the Hrachar-Hartzahar was filled with the same blinding light, which, as I have already told you, I experienced when I was outside the Hrachar-Hartzahar. Okay, so now he sees the light. It appeared that the said light was obtained because by pressing this button, Gornohor-Harhak had again opened that part of the wall of the Hrachar-Hartzahar which had the property of permitting rays to pass through it. Cool. As he explained further, the light was only a consequence of the result of striving to reblend into a whole of the parts of the Okidanok proceeding in that absolutely empty space within the Hrachar-Hartzahar. And yeah, that's right, I'm mastering this now. You can't stop me, Gurge. You can't slow me down. And manifested owing to what is called reflection from outside back to the place of its arising. After this, he continued as follows. I shall now demonstrate to you how and by what combinations of the process of Jatklom and of the striving to reblend into a whole of the active parts of Okidanok there arise in planets from what are called the minerals which compose their interior present. Okay, hold on. So when pure Okidanok is broken apart by Jatklom and two parts smash together, it creates light. But when three parts come together, it just reblends into Okidanok. So there arise on planets from what are called minerals. But so this process of Jatklom also works on planets and it creates minerals. So a planet, when the process of Jatklom happens, perhaps is what he's saying, if you're able to remove one of the three forces that are released from the process of Jartklom, the two other forces striving to reassemble, if it's not a pure Akidonic, it arises certain things in that being concentration. So for a planet, this process which creates light, for a planet it'll create minerals, or specific minerals and gases. Okay, let's see what he says. Okay, compose their interior presence to definite formations of varying densities, as for instance, mineraloids, gases, metalloids, metals, and so on. How these latter are afterwards transformed owing to these same factors, one into another, and how the vibrations flowing from these transformations constitute just that totality of vibrations, which gives the planets themselves the possibility of stability in the process called common system harmonious movement. Okay. For my proposed demonstrating, I must obtain, as I always do, the necessary materials from outside, which my pupils will give me by means of appliances which I have prearranged. Okay. It is interesting to remark that while he was speaking, he was at the same time tapping with his left foot on a certain something, very much like what your favorites call the famous Morse transmission apparatus. Famous, be it said, of course, only on the planet Earth. Okay, so he was Morse coding his his assistants. And a little later, there slowly ascended from the lower part of the Krarharhartsachar a small something like a box, also with transparent walls, within which, as it proved later, were certain minerals, metalloids, metals, and various gases in liquid and solid states. Okay. Then, with the aid of various appliances, which were at one side of the table, he first of all, with complicated manipulation, took out from the box some what is called red copper. Is that a thing? Well, red copper. Yeah, I don't care about red copper hair. Is red copper a mineral? Okay, let me go red copper mineral. Okay, so you can peacock ore, cooperite. Composed is a minor ore of copper. Okay, so red copper is a thing. Very interesting. Very interesting. So you got some cooperite and placed it on the mentioned plate. So copper, remember, alchemically corresponds to Venus, and usually it goes green, but this is an ore that has gone red for some reason. This is that's an interesting correspondence. Red corresponds to Mars, so we got copper, Venus, and Mars, masculine, feminine. This is something, what is he saying? A substance that has a hermaphroditic quality. It has both masculine and feminine aspects to it. I'm just corresponding this alchemically, see what happens. Oh, there's something here. Okay. This metal is a definite planetary crystallization and is one of the densities required for the said stability in the process called common system harmonious movement. It is a formation from preceding processes of the action of the parts of the omnipresent Okidanok. And at the present moment, I wish to allow the subsequent transformation of this metal to proceed artificially and acceleratedly, by means of the peculiarities of the same factors. I wish to aid artificially the evolution and involution of its elements towards a greater density, or on the contrary, towards their transformation back to a primal state. So he's going to do some alchemy. He's going to turn it into prima materia. So instead of starting with lead to gold, he's starting with copper, and let's see what he makes it into. To make the picture of the further elucidatory experiments clear to you, I find I must first inform you, even if only briefly, of my first personal scientific deductions concerning the evidence of the causes and conditions owing to which there proceeds in the planets themselves the crystallizing of separate parts of the Okidanok, in these or other said definite formations. Whew. Evidently, First of all, from any non-law conformable Jartklom of the omnipresent Okidanok, which is in the presence of every planet, its separate parts are localized in the medium of that part of the presence of the planet, that is to say, in that mineral which was at the given moment in the place where the said non-law conformable Jartklom occurred. What? Evidently, first, let me just read that again. I'm tripping balls. First of all, from any non-law conformable Jartklom of omnipresent Okidanok, so any splitting of the Okidanok which is in the presence of every planet, its separate parts are localized in the medium of that part of the presence of the planet, that is to say, in that mineral which was at that given moment in the place where... Okay, so, like how he's done this experiment with the Okidanok and split it into parts and contained it, the planet does this in itself. It Jartkloms in itself, and the different laws crystallize as different minerals and then recombine in different ways. So this mineral, this red copper, is one part crystallization. And so if what is called the vibration of the density of the elements of the said medium has an affinity of vibration, this is very alchemical. He's doing some kind of alchemy here. He's splitting things apart and recombining them. With the said active part of the omnipresent Okidanok, then according to the world law called symmetrical entering, this active part blends with the presence of the said medium and becomes an inseparable part of it. And from that moment, the given parts of the omnipresent Okidanok begin, together with the said elements of the said medium, to represent the corresponding densities required in planets, that is to say, various kinds of metalloids or even metals, as for instance the metal I have placed in this sphere, and in which there will proceed artificially at this moment, at my wish, the action of striving to reblend the whole of the parts of the Okidanok, in which metal, as I have already said, exists under the name of red copper. And further, having arisen in the planets in this way, the said various metalloids and metals then begin according to the common universal law called reciprocal feeding of everything in existence. Okay, hold on. So it's basically, I'm pretty sure he's saying what I assumed he said. This red copper is the product of the Jartklom process within the planet, splitting apart and then recombining into this red copper, and now he's connecting it to the autotrogo-egocratic law, the law of reciprocal feeding of everything. So according to this law of reciprocal feeding of everything existence, as it is general proper to arising of every kind in which Okidanok or any of its active parts participates, to radiate from their presences the results of their inner interchange of substances, as is proper to the radiations of every kind issuing from sur and intraplanetary formations. Well, everything in the universe radiates energy, or radiates something. You know, that's the whole thing of crystal Bibles and stuff, and crystals radiate supposed qualities, and same with plants, hence why certain incenses are used, or flowers are used on ceremonial altars. Same with animals, which is why specific animals are used in certain rituals, or animal parts at least. So this is the theory of rays. There's some which is found in ceremonial magic and sympathetic magic. All of these tables of correspondences are basically showing tables of different rays. So a planet creates different things through this process of Jartklom, and the different things created then issue off and connect harmoniously through a law of reciprocal existence. And when I say connect, it's like they radiate then different variations of radiation. So the universe is a very complicated place. Or using basic principles, it becomes complicated very quickly. And everything is interconnected and interchanges. Substances interchange energies all the time. property of the archidonic or of its active parts, and which are in what is called the center of gravity of every such formation. Okay, let me just... to radiate from their presences the results of their interchange of substances, and as is proper to the radiations of every kind issuing from certain interplanetary formations that have acquired their vibrations, the property of archidonic or of its active parts, which are in what is called the center of gravity of every such said formation. The radiations of these metalloids and metals possess properties almost similar to the properties of the archidonic itself, or of one or another of its active parts. So they all have properties, is what I meant. I said qualities. Anyway, when the said masses of different densities that have arisen in planets under normal surrounding conditions radiate from their common presences the vibrations required for the said world law of reciprocal feeding of everything existing, then among these vibrations various properties that is established owing to the fundamental law tromedekphi, a reciprocal acting contact. Okay, this is a new word. Remember this, the world law. Tromedekphi. And that is a law of reciprocally acting contact. So when things come into contact and act in a certain way, that action is reciprocated. So if you give energy, that thing will give energy back to you. If you send energy to a place, that place will send energy back. And the result of this contact is the chief factor in the gradual change of the various densities in planets. So a planet, via Jartklom, will break apart its forces, and these forces will turn to minerals, which will then reconnect and recombine, and the minerals and metalloids and gases will all have different properties, which will radiate in different ways, different vibrations, which via the law of reciprocal feeding will go out and feed other heavenly bodies, and the other heavenly bodies are being concentrations because of the law of tromedekphi reciprocally then send their own vibrations and rays back, and then these vibrations and rays, which are perhaps variations of archidonic themselves, then feed and then interact with these principles, these concentrations. They then change. They then change and interconnect and then feed that planet. It's all it's all very reciprocal. Because then what? I'm not sure if he said what happens when the energy comes back. Is a crystallization formed? Because there's that way, 1/4 way teaching where it basically says something like, what does an orange tree create? And you're supposed to say oranges. And then the 4th way teacher says, nope, wrong. An orange tree creates flowers. A bee, an outside force, or a wasp, comes in and pollinates the flower, and that creates the orange. So an orange tree only creates something up to a certain level, but via the flower then radiates outwards, a certain sense, and the bee comes and takes that. So via reciprocal acting contact, it takes something, but it also gives something back. It's able to pollinate it, which then initiates the flower into a new level of crystallization, which then creates an orange, which has seeds in it, which can create a new tree or can sustain other life, which then are a part of completely other octaves and vibrations. So he's basically talking about this really complicated, harmonious development of the universe. And the result of this contact is the chief factor in the gradual change of the various densities of the planet. My observations over many years have almost fully convinced me that it is owing only to the said contact and its results that there is actualized the stability of harmonious equilibrium of planets. So it's this interplay of rays and feeding and creation that the planets actually stay in orbit. Planets stay in orbit because they have a relationship with each other. So it's not gravity, it's this radiation. They all kind of feed off of each other and feed each other. And for that they need to be close, they need to be like a family. This metal red copper, which I have placed in the sphere of my proposed artificial actualization of the active parts of Okidenok, has at this moment what is called a specific density, reckoning from the unit of density of the sacred element Theo-Mert-Malogos of 444. That is to say, the atom of this metal was 444 times more dense and as much less vivifying than the atom of the sacred Theo-Mert-Malogos. Now see in what order its artificially accelerated transformations will proceed. Having said this, he first fixed before my organ of sight the automatically moving tescuano, so a telescope or a microscope, I guess it's both, and then turned on and off various switches in a certain sequence, and as I looked through the tescuano, he explained to me as follows. At this moment, I admit the influx of all three parts of Okidenok into the sphere containing this metal, and as all three parts have the same density, and hence the same force of striving, they reblend into a whole in this sphere without changing anything in the presence of the metal. And the omnipresent Okidenok, thus obtained, flows in the usual state through a special connection out of the Hartzachar. So I'm just re-getting that, and is reconcentrated in the first container which you have already seen. Now look, he says again with an explanation point, I deliberately increase the force driving of only one of the active parts of the Okidenok. For example, I increase the force called cathodnaceous. In consequence of this, you see the elements composing the presence of the red copper begin to evolve towards the quality of the substances that compose the ordinary presences of planets. So it's disintegrating and turning into dirt or something. As he explained this, he at the same time turned on and off various switches in a certain sequence. Although, my boy, so I think whenever that's said, that's indicating Beelzebub talking to Hassian, I then looked very attentively at everything preceding, and everything I saw was impressed in me, in my essence, pestolnutierly, that is, forever. Forever, yet nevertheless, not even with my best wish could I now describe to you in words 100th part of what then proceeded in that small fragment of a definite interplanetary formation. So, when something is impressed on you, pestolnutierly, it is engraved in you forever, like a part of your being, but it's very hard to describe, because it's at such a deep level. And I will not try to put it into words for you what I then saw, because I have just thought of a possibility of soon actually showing it all to you, when you also can be an eyewitness of so strange and astonishing a cosmic process. So he charged a vat with ether with red copper in it, and then modulated it so so the ether has three aspects, and only one of its aspects, I think he made it what's that called? The cathodnaceous is the negative part, or the denying force, and it started to disintegrate, but something happened which he's not describing to us. But I will tell you, meanwhile, that there proceeded in that fragment of red copper something rather like those terrifying pictures which I occasionally observed among your favourites on the planet Earth through my tescuano on Mars. I said rather like because what occasionally proceeded from your favourites had a visibility only possible of observation of its beginning, whereas in the fragment of red copper the visibility was continuous until the final completion of transformation. So what in pictures, what painting? So when you paint something, but it's only the beginning of the process, whereas he saw the entire process. I don't know what that means. Or maybe he means like a flash camera? It's like the flash happened, but then he saw the continuous process. A rough parallel can be drawn between the occasional proceedings on your planet and the proceedings then in that small fragment of copper. If you imagine yourself high and looking down upon a large public square, where thousands of your favorites, seized with the most intense form of their chief psychosis, are destroying each other's existence by all kinds of means invented by themselves, and that in their places there immediately appear what are called their corpses, which, owing to the outrages done to them by the beings who are not yet destroyed, change colour very perceptibly, as a result of which the general visibility of the surface of the said large square is gradually changed. Okay, so the red copper, it sounds like it's going through a process of destruction, and it's changing colour because of that. Then, my boy, this subsequent essence friend of mine, Gurnohor Harhak, by means of switching on and off the influx of these three active parts of Okidanok, and changing their force of striving, also changed the density of the elements of the said metal, and thereby transformed the red copper into all the other also definite intraplanetary metals of lower or higher degree of vivifyingness. The red copper into all the other also. Okay, so he then, by changing the modulations of the Okidanok, the ether, he transformed the red copper into different metals. So he's doing alchemy, basically. And here, for the elucidation of the strangeness of the psyche of the three brain beings who have taken your fancy, it is very important and interesting to note that while Gurnohor Harhak was, with the aid of his new invention, artificially and deliberately producing the evolution and involution of the density and vivifyingness of the elements of red copper, I noticed very clearly that this metal was transformed once upon the said plate into just that same definite metal, about which the sorry savants of your planet have been wiseacring during nearly the whole of their arising and existing, in the hope of transforming other metals into this metal, thus constantly leading astray their already sufficient erring brethren. This metal is called there gold. Called it. Gold is no other than the metal we call Pritzat Hal Avir. Pritzat Halvir. That was pretty good. I think I did that well. The specific weight of which, reckoning from the elements of the sacred Theomertmologos, is 1439. That is to say, its element is 3 and a fraction times less vivifying than the element of the red copper, of the metal red copper. Because the thing with alchemy is, if you're able to change the metal, can you change yourself? This is the thing. Are you able to make yourself immortal? Why I suddenly decided not to try to explain to you in detail in words all that took place in the fragment of the said red copper, in view of my suggestion of the possibility of soon actually showing you in definite intraplanetary formations of the processes of various combinations of the manifestations of the active parts of Okidanok, was because I suddenly remembered the all-gracious promise given me by our all-quarters maintainer, the most great arch-cherub Peshtvognir. Okay, so one of the tetra maintainers of the universe, which I believe Sakaki became one of those, didn't he? He got promoted. And so one of the other is Peshtvognir. And this all-gracious promise was given me as soon as I returned from exile, and had to present myself first of all to his all-quarters maintainer, the arch-cherub Peshtvognir, and prostrate myself to produce before him what is called essence sacred Alia Mizurnakalu. Sorry, what is this? And this all turned from exile. So he's now jumping stories. He's talking about when he returned from exile, he met this arch-cherub and went through a process called Alia Mizurnakalu. This I had to do on account of the same sins of my youth, and I was obliged to do so because when I was pardoned by his uni-being endlessness and allowed to return to my native land, certain sacred individuals decided to demand of me, for any eventuality, to have performed over my essence this sacred process in order that I might not manifest myself as in the days of my youth, and that the same might not thereby occur again in the reason of most individuals dwelling here at the center of the great universe. So what is this process limits him in some way. You probably do not know yet what the sacred Alia Mizunarkalu over an essence means. I shall later explain it to you in detail. Press X to doubt. But meanwhile, I shall simply use the words of our dear Mullah Nasir Eddin, who explains this process as giving one's word of honor not to poke one's nose into the affairs of the authorities. So he promised he'd be a good boy. In short, when I presented myself to this all-quarters maintainer, he deigned to ask me, among other things, whether I had taken with me all the being productions which had interested me, and which I had collected from various planets of that solar system where I existed during my exile. I replied that I had taken almost everything, except those cumbersome apparatuses which my friend Gur Nahur Harhak had constructed for me on the planet Mars. He at once promised to give orders that everything I should indicate should be taken at the first opportunity on the next trip to the spaceship Omnipresent. That is why, my boy, I hope that everything necessary will be brought to our planet Karatus, so that when we return there, you'll be able to see it all with your own eyes, and I shall be able to explain everything in detail practically. And meanwhile, during our traveling here on the spaceship Karnak, I shall, as I have already promised you, tell you in their order about my descents there to your planet, and also about the causes of what is called my appearance there in person. Oh, we made it. We made it. We made it through the arch preposterous. Almost 2 hours. Jesus Christ, that was a tough one. Thank you for coming along on that journey, everyone. Or if you're watching in the future, if you've made it this far, congratulations, you are now one of the few elite. We'll keep going same time next week. Until then, thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe, and if you want to keep things going, please do consider giving us a one-time donation or becoming a member. Thank you all so much. Goodbye.